What makes a survival horror game? I'm asking this not in hopes of getting a clear-cut answer, but instead to highlight the fact that finding said answer is not as easy as I thought. Pretty much everyone will have a different interpretation of what they want to see from the genre, what it means to them, and really, it's always a matter of taste. Your own personal preferences, what you grew up with, it all makes up a collection of information determining what makes you enjoy what you've enjoyed. For some, it's the time spent backtracking in Siren, narrowly avoiding the Shibitos, all while trying to figure out the game's multi-layered puzzles. For others, it's the late nights spent with friends, shooting the shit in Left 4 Dead, and the chaotic gameplay that ensued from that. And for me, well, it's kinda complicated. Back in the day, survival horror was practically synonymous with some of its most prominent features: tanky controls, funky angles, and tricky item management. But nowadays, it's a whole lot harder to neatly categorize what does or doesn't fit in with the genre, especially since it seems to redefine itself every couple of years. Survival horror is dead, and we have killed it, says the imaginary strawman I just invented for the sake of my argument. And to that I say, fuck off with that pretentious bullshit. I never bought into the whole RE4 killed the genre or other variation of the same factoid regurgitated online. Since the very start, survival horror has been defined by its constant evolution. And yeah, RE4 defo was a massive switch to the formula, but that's just the nature of innovation. Just like the Sweet Homes and Twilight Syndromes of yesteryear, the classic Resident Evils and Silent Hills made way for a different kind of horror with the rise of first and third-person shooters. In turn, those two inevitably made way for another wave of spooky games, each subsequent generation bringing something new yet familiar to the table. And I mean, if you're looking exclusively for more traditional survival horror, there's plenty of incredibly talented devs, especially in the indie scene, who are clearly very passionate about preserving that retro feel, either because they want to recapture that sense of helplessness that came with the funky control scheme, or maybe because they just happen to really vibe with the concept used in those older cult classics. There's so many games that end up playing with those familiar tropes and stylistic contrivances, but use them to a different extent, or even in other genres entirely. In a way, it'd be easy to say that everything that has tank controls and relatively spooky monsters could be seen as survival horror. But at the same time, is it really though? And if so, does it matter all that much? I've always vibed with games that toyed around the genre in more ways than one. The Echo Knights to my Hell Knight, the Overbloods to my Dino Crisis, the even Michigan Report from Hell. All stuff that was deemed not cool enough to fit in with the popular boys, yet somehow made their way deep into my heart, forever to be etched in there. Either because they happened to be a little too ambitious for the time, or maybe because they were actually secretly underrated. There's no sense in preoccupying yourself too much in what is basically glorified labels. You know, terms that make it easier for you to find games you may or may not vibe with. But rest assured, in this house we love all types of horror. The quiet, the loud, and sometimes the outright weird. Which leads us nicely to today's topic, a game much alike those prototypical titles. One that dared to innovate and create something new out of ideas we'd already seen before. A game that both profusely used and refused those archetypal horror conventions, in what is now only known as Galerians. Tank controls, fixed camera angles, character designs channeling unfiltered teenage angst, and psychic powers that turn people's brain into goo. This is what Galerians is best described as, an amalgamation of themes befit of its description as a psychic 3D action adventure. Yet all of this still didn't prevent gaming journalists at the time from instantly comparing it up and down to its modern contemporaries. And I mean, I get that. From a first glance, the Steiner house can look pretty similar to RE1's Spencer mention, even if it's only thematically. The Michelangelo Memorial Hospital and its sterile interior giving off big umbrella vibes. And the overall control scheme is, well, I think you can see for yourself. Though to be fair, that last one defo got a lot of other games compared to the Resis and Silent Hills of their era. I'm not high enough on my own ass fumes to deny the similarities, because I mean, they're obviously there, but this sort of surface level analysis is kinda where it ends. Galerians, at least to me, was an experience that stood on its own. Sometimes on wobbly legs for sure, but that shit happens. The occasional fuck-ups and frustrations here and there didn't deter too much from the absolute stylish madness the game exudes. With the exception of maybe Kowloon's Gate and its walled city, I don't think there's anything out there that speaks more to me in how grimy things be than how Galerians does it. Each location you make your way to gets progressively darker and dirtier than the last. The drugs you find stashed practically everywhere across the levels. The way our emo boy protag will just inject that shit right into his neck, no hesitation whatsoever. And the enemy design fitting in with the semi-Akira, semi-Parasite Eve mood the game's got going. The scenery slowly shifting from dystopian cyberpunk aesthetic to body horror hellscape. There's just something really cool about the way Galerians presents itself. In retrospect, I'm kinda mad I missed out on this shit for so long. I didn't grow up with a PlayStation, and by the time I got one, a PS2 to be specific, I was too busy playing Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy X. It's only really because of my girlfriend, the official hookup to what's cool and underrated on that side of the console war, that I even learned about Galerians in the first place. A game whose style transcends the 17 inches thick walls surrounding the research facility you start in. Story-wise, it tells the tale of Rion Steiner, a 14-year-old amnesiac boy, waking up strapped up to some unholy contraption. Forcefully given psychic powers, our resident emo boy decides to break out of the hospital he's kept in when he hears a cry for help in his mind from a girl who claims to know him. This sends Rion on a wild chase throughout the city, as he goes from secret laboratories to abandoned mansions and dingy hotels, all in hopes of finding Lilia. The stakes rising ever so higher as our protag's being tailed by the titular Galerians, a bunch of genetically enhanced psychic goons who were tasked in finding Lilia by a certain Dorothy, an angry supercomputer with a severe case of god complex, her only goal being to watch humanity die out for its sins. Rion seemingly caught in the midst of all of this, or maybe he is more involved than you were initially led to believe. It's mysterious, it's hella stylish, it's bordering on the existential, and sometimes it can feel a little bit extra.
Heart rate normal. Administer the Nalcon.
Won't that destroy his brain cells and prove fatal?
It might, but we must follow the clinic chief's orders.
Okay then.
But I don't know, I fuck with the melodrama that comes from the convoluted plot. Though, to get the said cool parts, first we need to start from the beginning. In a room, mind you, with two seemingly locked exits, the threat of this very ominous bar on your HUD filling up over time, an extremely vague explanation as to what you're supposed to do. I always try to give the benefit of the doubt to stuff that's not clearly shown to the player, because I mean, I've played this sort of game before, and you've probably done too, so we instinctively know to press our nose against every wall, every object to see what you can interact with. But still, if you're not aware that Rion can use his telepathic powers on an entirely separate button other than the interact one to open this very specific door, you're kinda left to your own devices, spinning in circle in the very first room. Especially since the only note available there is chock full of medical mumbo-jumbo. Which I mean, that's cool and all that. I've always loved this sort of flavored text. It's this very casual approach to world building. But it doesn't really help when it could have been a much clearer explanation as to what each item does. It would have been good information to have since you'll be using them a lot throughout your playthrough. Not that everything is bad though. To the game's credit, the rest of it is fairly straightforward from that point onwards. But I can definitely see why people complain about lack of direction in scenarios like this. Which is why I will take a quick minute to explain, hopefully not in the kindergarten teacher way, what the game refuses to explain. Your HUD consists of 3 bars representing HP, AP, and power respectively. The former being pretty self-intuitive, while the latter are much more interesting. Power represents which active ability Rion is currently wielding, something that can be changed on the fly by Psychic Power Enhancement Chemicals, or PPECs for short. There is Nalcon, which allows you to shoot shockwaves at enemies, Red, which allows you to burn people alive, while the late game D-Felon is your more traditional gravity-defying telekinesis. Since these eventually run out, you'll have to inject more PPECs straight into your veins if you want to keep blasting fools into the stratosphere. Certain enemies and bosses have resistance to certain type of attacks. Said attacks can be enhanced by an additional drug called Skip, which makes your abilities twice as strong, at the cost of having to maintain your health above 50% for it to work. In turn, HP is recovered through recovery capsules, another type of collectible. I think you get the gist. Even though the resources are technically finite, you never find yourself completely empty-handed. There's enough stuff to go through most of the game without feeling the pressure of having to save up everything you get. And if you do find yourself lost or without resources, you can always use the nifty hint system the game utilizes. By pressing the triangle button in front of certain background elements or key items, you can scan them with your telepathic powers, showing you clues as to how to progress, what to do, or even where to find stuff. It acts as this really cool alternative to just checking a guide to see where to go. Though it does come at the cost of some of that precious AP bar, that which when filled up will make Rion go absolutely berserk the next time you try to do anything telepathic. Short-circuiting, or shorting as the game puts it, is probably Galerian's coolest feature. with Rion just holding his head, slowly walking towards his enemies and detonating the fuck out of their skulls as he just casually walks on. It speaks to the very edge in my soul. Though shorting isn't a solution to every problem, as much as I wish it was. For one, it doesn't work on bosses besides the very first one. And two, your health starts declining rapidly the moment you go full on Tetsuo. You can circumvent this by taking Delmador, a funky little blue pill that renders Rion, well, flaccid for a lack of better term, stabilizing his health but not recovering it. And since the AP bar fills up by practically doing anything, from regular combat to even just spending a bit too much time fucking around, Galerians' overall combat mechanic becomes this really satisfying game of micromanagement where you can actively pool your resources or even use an AP pill, which automatically fills the bar up, to make sure you're shorting at the right moment. Though to be honest, the first time I kinda just whiffed that shit on a single enemy. But you get the idea. One of my concerns originally was that the AP bar would make me rush through the game, since you're technically acting under a loose but still very much existing time limit. The amount of Delmadors you can find through each level is finite, so if you're not careful with shorting, you can technically soft lock yourself. But it really wasn't that bad. Unless you're actively chugging every pill you find the moment you see them, you should probably be alright. The game's pretty generous with the stuff, and in a way, kinda made the backtracking worth it. I'm actually kinda surprised at how smooth the entire experience was, though that does come with a huge asterisk I'll talk about later. The controls are as stiff as you can imagine, but the level layout is fairly generous with the amount of space you got, which means most of the time you can avoid attacks without the fear of getting shot in the back by an enemy off screen. I say most of the time because the game isn't exactly without flaws. As much as I love Galerians on a conceptual level, because it looks and feels cool to me, it also got some pretty egregious shit here and there. The camera can sometimes obfuscate your movement, and there's some real bastard enemy hours with stuff like this room in the hotel where, if you're not ready to short, these goons will just stunlock the shit out of you. And I don't know man, when this stuff happens to you and you haven't saved for like 30 minutes because prior to that the level was fairly without danger, it's kinda where the cracks in the game start showing. The hotel starts really strong with this ominous murder mystery vibe, where the more you progress through the level, the more murder scenes you stumble upon, and you just gotta go around trying your best to figure out who's behind it. But in the end, it devolves really fast into hella backtracking, complete with fetch quests, and a door-knocking puzzle out of all things. No matter how confident I was that I was replicating the knocks with the same exact rhythm, it just took way too long to properly register. And I mean, the game defo had some of those elements prior too, the hospital and mansion both having cool puzzles and often ask of you to go back to rooms you had already visited, which is something we've all seen from the survival horror genre. But man, the hotel is just go to this room, have the person there tell you what room you need to go to next, get to the elevator, go to the next floor and then find the number of that room you need to go in. Repeat until every room is cleared. All of this wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't also accompanied by the classic PS1 loading screens every 12 seconds. Not that I'm hard pressed for time, but you know, Galerians may have 3 discs, but it ain't no Final Fantasy if you catch my drift. A lot of that disc space was reserved for the shit ton of FMVs you'll be watching, and the 4 unique stages the game has to offer. Hopefully this doesn't come off as me needlessly complaining about video game length, because it's quite the opposite. I've always favored concise and impactful experiences over artificially padded grindfest. The whole game took me, I think, 5 or so hours, and that's with me really taking my time in each level, searching every nook and cranny, getting stuck here and there and all that good stuff. I mention it not as a detriment to the overall experience, but rather in that usual reviewer kind of way. You never know who's gonna want to play this shit after watching my shit, so if that shit bothers you, then you've been warned. And speaking of warning, that huge asterisk from earlier stands for Galerians bosses. Spoilers and all that stuff aside, they're actually really fucking challenging. From the very first boss, Dr. Lem comboing you into stun locks, to Birdman having extremely small attack windows, to Rita also comboing you into stun locks. They really weren't pulling back any punches, huh? I mean, just look at the Dorothy fight. You have to hit those floating eyeballs which have tiny hitboxes, all while dodging a laser that sweeps through the stage every couple of seconds. Stage that is, by the way, completely obscured, messing up with your depth perception. Just some real pain in the ass type of moment. It's really because of those bosses that the limitation of the combat system starts showing up. You don't always have the time to plant your feet into the ground and start charging your moves, because one wrong move and you get Shun Goku Satsu'd by the boss, you feel? Even though I joke a lot about being on the masochistic side, I don't typically get angry at video games, even when they do get admittedly pretty fucking tough. I try to play and cover stuff on this channel because I see genuine value in them, and I hope it shows through what I'm presenting to you. But there was this moment in the Birdman fight, where after getting bounced around for 10 minutes, I kinda stopped to think, is this really worth my time? Obviously, since you're watching this video right now, the answer is yes, but it still didn't prevent me from putting the controller down for a bit. You know, in hopes of coming back to it a couple hours later, with a fresh mind, a new attitude. Still ended up gritting my teeth through that whole boss fight, but overall, I think it was worth it. Gameplay-wise, Galerians may not be the best. A lot of its flaws come from it being this prototypical action-adventure game using a survival horror formula. I can't really fault it for wanting to stray away from the norm though, because it's literally why I picked it up in the first place. Flaws and all, I feel like the overall experience had a lot to offer, most of which did feel worthwhile to me. Even considering the bumpy road to get there. A lot more positive than negative, if you will. It would have been easy for me to spend this entire video into some unnecessary bashing on an old game 12 people still care about, but I'm not about that life. Instead of spending time ideating on what could have been or should have been, I'd rather focus on what was there, what I actually vibed with. It's not like all the bosses were awful either. There's plenty of cool stuff to witness, even if it's only for the thematic approach. Like the Reinhardt fight was actually really fun. He uses a lot of wide-hitting moves, even summons those slow fiery goons that keep on following you until you dispatch them. The entire fight utilizes effectively the tiny room you're stuck in. Just like the other boss fights, it asks of you to be quick and certain with your movement, but it feels a lot more forgiving. It's a lot of fun when it works out. Same thing goes for the Kane fight. I mean, just look at the arena. There's just you and him in this penultimate fight to see who's the better of the two. Just really fucking cool. It's crazy how I can easily point out the flaws of this game and criticize them in a rough but fair way, yet the moment they hit me with that Sonic vs Shadow type of shit, I'm drooling at the mouth. I just love that stuff, no matter how cheesy it gets. Like yeah, Galerians may not have the perfect modern combat experience, but just peep those fucking designs. Starting slowly with the medical staff, workers, and guards alike, only to rapidly devolve into body horror territory with stuff like the Arabesque, this gross-ass flesh monster. Everything is made to look as threatening as possible. From the armed security units with their big hazmat suits and riot shields, to the grey man ominously stalking your house, topped with a hat and coat to match, making sure to drive the point home. And most importantly, Dorothy. It's such a shame that her design was practically unused for like 95% of the game, but the moment you see her in that full glory, this is why I love Galerians. Not the huge god complex artificial intelligence fleshy mommy. Well, maybe a bit. But mostly because it constantly skirts with horror in its respective themes. It's really through those aspects of design that it shows front and center. The weird human experiment baby looking at you from its test tube in the hospital. The idea that Dorothy went haywire the moment she was told about God and how humans have to abide by his word, therefore she must obey humans since they created her. How she ends up creating this squad of psychic fuckos that will do her bidding instead. The implications that came with learning about what Galerians truly are. How they're technically artificial humans created in giant woman-shaped incubators, complete with wombs, bellies, and large tube nipples. Every detail from the weird-looking level designs channeling the best out of common horror tropes, to the small stuff like if you kill scientists but leave one of them alive, the last one standing will just try to revive their homies to no avail. Shame that I blew my psychic load all over them, but you know, it's the effort that counts. The way each character looks like they were ripped straight out of a 1999 Hot Topic. I live for this shit. Rion looks cool and all, with his Tetsuya Nomura reject looking ass, but look at Kane over there in his TMR outfit. Homie's got style dripping out the ass. It's the stuff every edgy teen wanted to look like back then. And if your mom wasn't cool enough to let you dress up like that, then it defo was what you draw your OCs wearing, doodling in the middle of class. Peak 90s edgy Kino, if you will. Everything in Galerians captures perfectly the grungy emo zeitgeist from that era, from the start to the very end. The entire time I was playing through Galerians, even after finishing it, I kept wondering, with each plot twist, each new character, why didn't they make an anime out of this? Like, the inspiration's clearly there, with stuff like Rion being seemingly inspired by Tetsuo from Akira, the entire setting taking place in this retro-futuristic cyberpunk world, and well, turns out they actually did make an anime out of it. An OVA, mind you, that took everything I loved about the game and neatly condensed it into 3 separate parts. Galerians Rion came out a couple years after the original game on both DVD and PSP UMD, so you know that shit's Gucci. It also apparently aired on MTV quite a bit, with an OST filled to the brim with stuff like Godhead and Slipknot. Go figure why all the now 30-plus-year-old ex-emo kids fuck with this shit. The OVA follows the same exact plot as the game, but this time trimming some of the fat, all while expanding on what I actually vibed with. The characters end up being the focal point for most of its runtime. You learn a lot more about who's who and what the titular Galerians actually are, what their purpose is. It's a lot more fun than just seeing them as mindless antagonists sent out there to beat Rion's ass. Showing that each individual Galerians had their own worldviews, motivations, feelings, fears. It's nice to see the potential of character building being developed upon here. Like how Reinhardt's obsession with clocks came from his trauma of being forcefully fed PPECs at 3 PM every day. So every time you see a clock, it stops at 2:50, a recurring motif you see a lot throughout the game. Yet the OVA gives it a lot more meaning, with Reinhardt begging on his knees, almost crying. A similar scene is shown in the game after you defeat him, but up until then, he kinda was just Psychic Goon number 2, you feel? Same thing goes for Rita and her desire to completely cease existing the moment she's defeated by Rion, going to the length of asking him to straight up kill her because she knows Dorothy won't accept failure. Or like earlier when I mentioned the whole Rion versus Cain being some light versus dark stuff. It's fairly obvious that with a name of biblical importance like Cain, that his backstory would be very integral to Rion's existence. It's all stuff that felt cool while playing, but really gets expanded upon while watching. Really good stuff overall. Each boss fight is shown through the lens of stereotypical, half fighting, half discussing about the past, concepts important to the main story, and all the stuff you'd expect out of an anime, but it's at least coherent. It could have done without some of the overly exposition-y bits, but since Rion is amnesiac, it makes sense for him not to know what anyone else is talking about, especially when it comes to stuff like his true identity, the real goal behind Dorothy's motivations, and all that really interesting world building. Another huge thing that helped make this a lot more digestible than the original is the voiceover. Not to say the game's voice acting or dub work was pretty bad, but you know, it was made in 1999, and when other games around that time were pulling shit like RE1's infamous Jill sandwich or other Me Morphy lines, you kinda know what to expect.
Rion!
What am I doing here?
How did you get out of your restraints?
What was in that shot you gave me?
Rion, return to your bed now!
How did I get this power?
I'm sure in Japanese it was probably a lot better, especially since they got the ever-so-flowery Akira Ishida to voice Rion, but still, it's really through the light anime budget that the OVA voices shine through. It's a lot more fun when you got Dio as one of the bad guys, rather than whichever 30-year-old at the office decided to act like a snarky teen today.
Ever since you escaped from the hospital.
While I do have a slight preference for video games as a media, mostly because of their potential for interactivity, the OVA ended up being a really cool companion piece to the whole game. It's definitely not necessary for your enjoyment of it, but it was pretty nice to kick back and watch fully rendered action scenes of what was pretty much relegated to some crunchy PS1 FMVs. All things considered, for something that was sold to me under the pretense of, it's just like Resident Evil, but with an emo twink that's not Steve Burnside, Galerians did a pretty good job at what it set out to do. It definitely wasn't as culturally impactful to the overall gaming landscape as some of its survival horror contemporaries, but it did end up leaving a huge impression on a ton of people, and I can totally see why, because it too left a huge impression on me. It made me think back a lot on the public perception of any media deemed quote-unquote edgy. A lot of people have a negative reaction to even just hearing the word, because edginess has become associated to big muscly dudes ripping guys in half while cracking jokes, or overly grimdark boys suffering for the sake of looking cool. Which, to be fair, does happen quite a bit in any form of media, but that's beyond the point. Today, I want you to open your mind to the edge, if only for a bit, to welcome it wholeheartedly and see what it can be and what it means to me. Edge is the personification of a feeling many of us have felt growing up, something that most of us still feel to this very day, the desire to be seen as competent through your vulnerabilities. It somehow manages to put a word to that feeling. Edge is not about licking your bloody blade after striking your foe down while smugly looking at the audience. It's wanting to have your feelings understood, seen, acknowledged without having to say so. To cry out your pain, your anger, all that built-up frustration without being seen as lesser for doing so, without being judged. It's characters like FF7's Cloud not being able to live with the fact that he's stolen the identity of his dead friend, effectively becoming the shadow of a better man. Squall from FF8 slowly opening up to Renoa, to his friends after years of secluding himself, not because of some pretentious emo boy complex, well, maybe just a bit, but mostly because of his deep-rooted fear of solitude, of rejection. This shit has more than a place in modern media, Because what Galerians has on the surface may look like just some fucked up emo boy going around town killing other fucked up emo boys, girls, and anything in between, but on the inside, Galerians is a story about a fight against the establishment. Establishment that just so happens to take the shape of a giant robo-flesh deity, but the feeling's there nonetheless. Rion and Lilia are fighting to ensure a brighter tomorrow. There's more to it than just doom and gloom. There's a certain light at the end of the tunnel. And I don't know, maybe I'm a little overdramatic about this shit, but I'm very passionate, maybe to a fault. Ever since I was a kid, I've always had an interest in that sort of characters, storytelling devices and whatnot. The troubled and mysterious vagabonds, the doubting yet more than qualified protagonists. There's something humbling, almost relatable, about seeing your heroes falter, but get back up time and time again, to persevere through adversity. Yeah, there's the cocky, macho bravado shit too, but that's secondary. I'm not gonna deny that there's a ton of edgy shit in Galerians. I mean, injecting drugs directly into your neck with a gun-shaped syringe. Like, yeah, I get it bro, your mom bought you a Disturbed album at age 12. But in spite of it all, it really doesn't come off as some teenager's fantasy ego trip. There's some excessive grunting, all sorts of anime tropes. Seeing Rion holding his head going did make me die a little inside, but I feel like it still manages to come off as pretty earnest in the grand scheme of things. Sometimes edge can be alright. To call it a guilty pleasure would be frankly dishonest, because at this point, I ain't afraid to say, I fucking loved Galerians through and through. Its world, its gameplay, even going to the length of stomaching the pretty frustrating bits. There's just a lot of cool stuff to explore in here. And the prospect of going to the sequel, Galerians Ash, makes me even more pumped. Haven't heard much about it, but the idea that Rion's now a 20-year-old still decked out like this is already good news. Just like this video, I don't think Galerians will appeal to everyone, but at least it did to me, and that's what matters, right? Even though I did admittedly delay this video quite a bit, out of fear that it would come off ironically as edgy itself, but I don't know. It always feels pretty liberating to talk about stuff I like, no matter how cringy it may seem. After all, to be cringe is to be free, so release me.